So as Haley said, yep, my name is Mark Townsend. I'm the Frederick County Ag Agent with University of Maryland Extension. Again, we're going to talk a little bit more about just kind of soil health. What is it? How do we measure it? Really, soil health has become a hot topic in ag and green circles. Been a topic of like great interest as it relates to climate change, managing agricultural production, especially in a changing world. However, it's not really a new thought process. This has been something that's been around for a really long time, quite frankly. We'll touch on that here a little bit. And we'll touch on some more like the basics as well. But I hope to kind of arm you with generally a good understanding of what soil health is as it relates to production systems as well as your garden. So first of all, briefly, there's a great debate over soil health, right? What is the definition? And we've seen kind of a change in thought process over the years in terms of what defines soil health, what kind of guides soil health, things like that. But before we dive into that, I really want to touch on what are the fundamentals, right? What makes up a soil? What happens in the soil? That's going to be what we're going to primarily touch on first, and then we'll move into the more kind of nuanced details of what soil health does in terms of our production. This is the breakdown of soil as it relates by volume. Okay, so there are kind of the three general mechanisms, or rather we can say just there's liquids and solids, right? So air or fluid, air comprises about 25% of soils, water about 25%, and then the mineral and organic fraction, those are going to be your solid fraction, right? So that's the part of the soil that we really kind of see and touch just about any time we're working in the soil, right? But however, it's really important to note that just about 50% of the soil is made up of pore space. And this is a really important kind of relationship or something to stay mindful of, in that, though these are not really strict numbers that we want, 50% pore space. Generally speaking, it's important to note that how large a role that empty space plays in our soil systems and how vital that is to growing plants. Really, it ensures the adequate air movement. It supports soil biology. We have to have water infiltration and movement therein. So we'll touch on that here in a moment. We'll also move into the organic fraction as well, but that's for a later discussion here. But for right now, we're going to jump into soil mineral particles, right? So what is a mineral particle? This is the portion of the soil that, again, we mostly see. This is the fraction of the soil that is the solids. These are formed by the weathering of rocks and minerals through time. Okay, so the first, and they're broken out by size. Okay, so there are three main components to the soil mineral fraction, right? There's sand, silt, and clay. So sand is the largest, right? These are particles that are about 2 millimeters at the largest to 0.05 millimeters. Above that, they're kind of considered more like small rocks or gravel. And then below that, we get into the silt fraction, right? So silt, this is kind of that in-between area, right? They're still pretty small particles. They're between 0.05, and 0.002 millimeters. So we're really kind of touching on that. Is it macroscopic? Is it microscopic? We're in this little area here. And then we move a little bit further down into the teeny tiny portion of soil, and that's clay, right? So clay is just about the size of bacteria. It is tiny. That being said, it's about less than 0.002 millimeters, right? So to fully see clay, we actually need to do some microscopy, right? We actually really need to delve into, the micro fraction of the soil. So all of these are formed through that weathering processes, right? So when the rocks that make up the geology beneath our feet, when they break down, when they tumble, when there are organisms living in them that slowly start to decay these larger minerals, that's how we form the sand, silt, and clay particles, right? These are the three portions that make up soil texture, okay? So soil texture is the relative proportion of each of those as they relate to each other, okay? So this is the USDA soil textural triangle. USDA uses this as a mechanism to classify soils, where on the spectrum do soils fall. And I'm sure we're all familiar with loams and what a loam is, or, maybe we don't know exactly what it is, but we've certainly heard it. Everyone talks about in the garden centers, oh, we need to have loam soils, or, this is going to provide, the benefits for us. Well, in actuality, loam just basically means that we have an equal relative fraction between sand, silt, and clay. Okay. This doesn't mean that they're split, 33.5% across the way. In fact, clay kind of plays a seriously important role in defining soil texture. If we take a look at the textural triangle, you'll notice how it's just about 20% clay until we start seeing clay in the name of the soil. It's worth noting as well, the names in the center of the triangle really describe what the dominant texture is. So a clay loam, right? That center portion right in the middle. Clay loam means that it's more clay than it is loam, right? Loam is obviously this well-balanced, right? Silt loam, a little bit more silt in the portion than there is the loamy portion. And then a sandy loam. So let's take an example, right? So this little yellow dot here means that about 70% of the soil in terms of texture is sand, right? Another 20% is made up of the silt portion, and then only just about 10% is clay. It's worth noting, so clay, it's hard to really overstate the role of clay as it relates to soils and how they all work. And we'll touch on that here in a moment, but I will say, when we talk about clay, I think everyone kind of hears clay or, that red clay, oh, it's red. That's what we have in Maryland. Well, clay in actuality is not necessarily one color. In fact, it's more of the oxides or the reflection that it takes on what else is in the soil that gives soil that color. So, for example, our soils are in fact that kind of reddish brown, when you start digging deeper. However, that's actually a result of rust in effect. Those are iron and aluminum oxides, these very, very small oxidative, chemically interesting things that coat soil colloids, soil particles that give it that color. So it's worth noting that clay doesn't really have a true distinct color, but rather it is a reflection of what else is there in the soil. So we can do soil testing at home, just kind of what is soil texture? What is the one that we're working with, right? Really simple way to do this is take a jar, and add about a third of the jar, or fill the jar about a third of the way up with a soil sample. Take a pretty good composite soil sample. What I mean with that is, take it at a certain depth, fix your depth, make sure that it's, say 6 inches or whatever. And then take it across your field or across your garden, right? Go ahead and fill that up to the third of the way, and then fill the rest with water. And then actually add a little bit, maybe a tablespoon or so of dishwasher detergent, and make sure that it's the granular kind, and shake it up so it becomes a slurry. Now, this is kind of where it gets really interesting. We're going to go ahead and let it sit there for about 2 minutes. The sand, because it's denser, it's larger, it's heavier, is going to sit down to the bottom of the jar in about 2 minutes. We're going to go ahead and measure the height of that above the bottom of the jar, and then that's basically the proportion that you have of sand. Same thing, 2 hours from then, we're going to go ahead and measure the middle portion, right? That's going to be your silt level, right? So that, again, that's sort of the middle particle. Takes a longer time for it to fall out because they're a little bit smaller and less dense. However, compared to clay is going to take 2 days to let it silt out, basically, to let it kind of fall to the bottom of that jar. Make sure you don't disturb it. Because since it's so fine, they will kind of disperse themselves amongst the rest of the water. So what we'll do after the 2 days is we'll take the height of each layer and we'll divide that by the total height that we had, and then that gives us a percentage, okay? And then at which point we can go back to our soil textural triangle and take a really rough idea of what kind of soil we have. Percent sand, percent silt, percent clay. Find ourselves in the middle of that, and then suddenly we know what our soil texture is. You can go to a lab, and they're going to do just about the same thing, except they're going to do it in a way more scientific methodology. However, it does the same general thing. So, we touched on clay and how important that is, and so really, again, clay is just about the seat of all chemical reactions. Clay is an incredibly important soil property or soil textural component. They're so small, we touched on this, right? They're so small that they take, 2 days to settle out of the suspension. This is a result of they're colloids, right? So they're incredibly small particles, and they're incredibly active. Really, a good example of a colloid, if you're not familiar with the term, is coffee. Coffee is a colloidal suspension of a coffee bean. The small little particles of the coffee bean are ground up and washed through and into the coffee drink itself, and we're actually drinking a colloidal suspension. With that, it would take years for it to fully settle out. That's not something that's necessarily possible. Well, with soils, because their clay does settle, it does fall out of suspension. So that's how we can measure it. But on the chemical end of things, clay is very, very important to the processes that occur in soils. So clay is negatively charged. Clay has, in the process of weathering, what ends up happening is that extreme weather event over eons, right? Millions of years, when we're breaking down those rocks, minerals, and it's slowly becoming, clay. There are little left, edges that are left untouched, or fractals, or kind of charge imbalances within the chemical makeup of the clay mineral. Well, this gives it predominantly a negative charge. Okay, so let's go back to just physics and chemistry 101. And what happens is we're going to do some electrostatic attraction. Okay, so clay wants to find itself a partner, wants to find itself a positively charged partner, so that it can neutralize the negative charge that it has on itself. Okay, so this is a fundamental soil property. This is what's known as cation exchange capacity. Cations are the very simple scientific way of just saying simply positively charged ions. So these are things like calcium, magnesium, potassium. I've got NH4 on there, that's ammonium. There are some others as well, but that being said, those are kind of the main ones that we see in a soil system, and really the ones that we most care about, because those are the ones that really drive plant growth. So cation exchange capacity is simply a measure of how well that soil can hold on to those nutrients, right? How many parking spots, right? How many negatively charged parking spots can those positively charged cations find themselves? How can they zorb, right? That's the term we use, zorb onto the clay particle. This is an incredibly important process in soil chemistry and soil chemical processes. And we'll see how this relates a little bit further, but just really, really important. I should note, we touched on this, right? So colloids and all that, CEC, cation exchange capacity, is heavily influenced by clay content as well as clay type. There are different types of clays. That's not worth getting into here for this discussion, but there are many, many different types of clays. And then we'll also see that organic matter, we touched on, what organic matter is just briefly. Organic matter plays a pretty significant role in this process as well. So soil pH, okay, so we generally consider this, so I work with farmers pretty regularly on, agronomic crops, right? Corn, soybeans, wheat, barley, all that. And this is the first thing that I tell folks to really address in the soil if I see an issue, right? Soil pH is the master soil variable. It controls many of the chemical, biological, and even sometimes the structural issue or the physical components of a soil. If we want to get super scientific, pH is the potential hydrogen, right? It's the negative log, so logarithmic, meaning, 10, 100, thousands, right, of the concentration of hydrogen ions. So the more hydrogen that we have in a solution, the lower the pH, right? And then therefore, the more acidic it is. So acidity is anything below 7. Alkalinity is everything above 7. 7 is neutral. That's roughly water, right? That's, there's debate over that, but it's water. Okay. So again, we can talk a little bit more about the science aspect here, but the inverse of pH is pOH. Okay. So the more alkaline we get, the more the pH rises. We see, 8, 9, 10. Okay. That's when we have a less amount of hydrogen in the soil, but we have a lot more hydroxyl, OH, right? I won't bore you with the chemistry, but it's a nice little relationship to know that pH or pOH are related. So cation exchange capacity and pH are pretty jointly related. They pH influences cation exchange capacity, or the ability of the soil to hold on to those nutrients that we talked about. So generally speaking, when pH rises, the cation exchange capacity increases. This is a really neat thing in soil, and I'm such a nerd about this, and the chemistry behind this is super, super cool. But that's just the general relationship that I think helps farmers and agrarians and gardeners even, generally understand. So the more that we can address soil pH, the more we're going to be able to hold nutrients better. Okay. So there are certain things, right? So nutrients kind of vary in their availability across a pH range. So take, for example, if we look on this kind of the diagram here, have you ever taken a soil fertility class or any soil fertility lecture? This is one that you'll most often see, and it really illustrates the degree of to which these nutrients are available in a soil system at different pH ranges. So let's look at, one of the more extreme examples is manganese, right? As soon as manganese hits about 5.5 in terms of pH, it's really not there, right? It's hard for that. It's hard for that soil to supply manganese to a crop. Now, manganese is a micronutrient, so plants don't necessarily need it in high concentration. So that's not a bad thing. And in actuality, really, there is a kind of a range of pHs that we really like to see in terms of crop production. About 6 to 6.5 is considered optimal. Within that range, our nitrogen, our potassium, and our phosphorus is most available, generally speaking. Those are our three big macronutrients. Those are the nutrients that plants really, really need, and they need them in large quantities. So with that, that's how we kind of address soil pHs, right? We want to see them kind of sit in that 6 to 6.5 range, okay? There are some certain crops that prefer a little bit more acidic soils. I'm thinking of like blueberries. And there are other crops that actually prefer a little bit more alkaline soils. So, agronomically, I'm thinking of alfalfa, right? Alfalfa for like dairies or something like that. But asparagus, right? Asparagus is another crop that generally prefers some more alkaline soils. pH plays a very, very important role, as we talked about, on nutrient availability, nutrient cycling, and it also plays a role in soil biology. So we'll talk a little bit about organic matter. It's really hard to understate the role of organic matter in soil processes. This is by far one of the most important parts of a soil, right? Although it makes up such a very small percentage of that soil as it relates, per volume, right? We talked about that in that ideal soil Venn diagram and how small of a piece that soil organic matter was. Well, it really plays an incredibly outsized role in soil chemical and biological processes. In particular, we talked on how, there are those exchange sites that clays have that, can move nutrients. Well, organic matter has the same thing. And actually, they have more of it per mass of the object. So very, very important. I should note that organic matter does not necessarily mean, or doesn't mean, the organic certification that the USDA gives. It's not like, oh, it's good, I have organic matter, therefore I'm an organic producer. No. Organic in chemistry is simply compounds or molecules that have a carbon-to-carbon bond or carbon-to-hydrogen bond, right? Think of organic chemistry, okay? So organic matter in soils are the partially decomposed dead organisms, right? So plant matter, bacteria, leaves, things that just slowly start to decompose through microbes. And what's really that gives it that black color is that humus, right? So this is what's known as the stable fraction of organic matter. So we have that really small portion of organic matter to begin with, but then we get even smaller, and there's a very small portion of the soil that is stable in terms of its organic matter, meaning that it will no longer go any further in terms of decomposition. However, that's really the seat of that chemical activity. Very, very important. So what does it look like? Well, in soils, in terms of our visual inspection of what we can see with our naked eye, organic matter, soils with higher organic matter appear darker. Though they may appear, when soils get wet, they appear darker. I'm really thinking of black, like a near black color, or a brown. We're seeing it transition to a darker color, okay? Also, under a microscope, this is what organic matter looks like. Look how complicated it is in terms of how it's all bound and strung together. And it's just incredible to see it up close. This is that humus particle, the stable fraction of the organic matter. Again, chemically, this is what organic matter roughly looks like. It's hard to say what it does and doesn't look like just because, it's so variable. There are so many things that make up organic matter, but this is kind of a really good rough estimation. However, look how complicated it is. Look at all these benzene rings, and we got an alcohol over there, and oh my gosh, like there's an amine group. I mean, it is just so incredibly complicated and chemically complex. With that, it's very chemically active. Okay, and that's really the function of organic matter in our soil systems, is it really does provide that chemically active fraction of the soil along with that clay. So functionally, what does this mean? Okay, so this affects our soil, all three properties, the chemical, biological, and physical properties, right? On the physical side of things, flocculation is just a fancy word for saying how soils bind to each other. Are they close? Are they far away from each other? Generally speaking, flocculation kind of relates to that pore space that we talked about earlier, that 50%, the 25% water, 25% air. So flocculation, if we have very good flocculated, well aggregated soils, meaning that they have lots of small joint particles, that gives us that good amount of air movement and water movement, right? So that's mainly driven through organic matter and the amount of organic matter that we have. Similarly, water holding capacity, how well can a soil hold that water, driven by organic matter. Infiltration, that has to do with flocculation and aggregation. Same thing with porosity, temperature. Really interesting how organic matter actually buffers soil temperature, slows it from becoming very hot or very cold, right? Chemically, we touched on this and just how complicated that macromolecule looks like. It plays a role in the cation exchange capacity of a soil. It also deals with nutrient release. How well can some of those nutrients that are on that complex macromolecule fall off and then be picked up by a plant root? pH, it buffers pH, it slows big changes in pH. And then biological, that's now the third time that I've touched on something about biological. We're getting somewhere with that. So biologically, those microbes, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, all those things kind of use a little bit of organic matter. They grab on some of those carbons or some of those little molecules that are there on the organic matter that's available to them, and they'll actually eat that. They'll respire that. That's what we do, right? We consume carbon, in effect, food, right? But that's their version of food, is that organic matter. That plays a role in nutrient cycles, also nutrient availability. So it's clear how important organic matter really is to a soil system, where it's becoming just, wow, this is incredible, okay? And this is really this can be a reflection of our management, right? There are certain things that we can do to really increase the amount of organic matter, provide us that benefit of having the organic matter in the soil. And there are other things that we do that actually kind of pull back that organic matter, right? That decrease the amount of organic matter that we see. We'll touch on that here in a moment. But so going back to the soil biology point, soils are alive, right? So microbes are really the seat. We talked about the seat of chemical activity, with organic matter and clays, but really all of those processes, just about all of them, are driven by the activity of soil biology, right? So though that only makes up, the fraction of the soil that is considered alive is only about 0.5%, 60 to 80% of the total soil metabolism, right? The nutrient cycling, the movement of those plant nutrients is due to that tiny portion by volume. Microbes are everywhere. We know this, this is nothing new. This is germ theory of disease 101, the man himself, Louis Pasteur, right? They're everywhere. But a 1 ounce of soil can contain about 28 billion bacteria, right? 3 billion actinomyces, 28 million fungi, and 3 million nematodes. This one, I took soils in college on. I love this class, and the one statistic that I'll never forget is that if you were to take 1 acre of soil 6 inches down and collect it all together and count the amount of living organisms that are in that, it's more living organisms than we understand there are stars in the entire universe. So again, kind of a wild thought in how prevalent those microbes are. Right here, we see some pictures. There's some earthworms. Those are the macro flora, right? So there's things that we can see. We also have the microflora. That's a picture of bacteria in that lower corner here. We've got a nematode here, and then there's also these little guys. These are rhizobia, right? So these are what actually bind to legumes, right? So things like beans or clover, things like that. they'll actually infect the roots of that plant. And miraculously, we don't have to go into it too much, but that symbiotic relationship between the bacteria in the soil and the plant itself create these small little nodules, and these nodules end up supplying the plant with nitrogen from the atmosphere. It's quite a miraculous process. Highly complicated, we don't have to go into it, but it's great to know that that role of bacteria or the role of microbes is on full display anytime there's a bean or a legume in the field. So soil biology, right? So, the soil food web, right? This is the cycling of nutrients. When we have organic matter, things like bacteria, fungi, they will start to decompose that organic matter. They'll munch on it, right? Well, then that protozoa will munch on the bacteria, and the nematode might munch on some fungi. And then an arthropod might jump on that. Maybe another nematode or predator nematode will eat the smaller nematode. And so this complex food web really provides the basis for the movement of nutrients, right? There are some residual things that are left over. And so this is the majority of the soil processes are kind of governed by the soil food web. So now I'm going to take a break here. I've talked your ear off. So let's do a quick little, what is it? Syllogism, right? So if soils have an incredibly diverse and numerous community of microorganisms that have profound effects on the intrinsic biological, chemical, and physical properties, then soil systems are interwoven within themselves, right? They're all kind of connected. Soil processes, soil chemical processes touch into biological processes, touch into physical processes. So thus, there is some sort of demonstrable quality of the soil. Can you have a good quality soil or low quality soil? Therefore, soil health, right? This is the basis. This is the foundation of soil health, right? And in essence, it's often a measure of soil biology, right? How much is there? How active is that soil? So soil health in some ways is, I like this definition, is a comprehensive expression of the relevant soil physical, chemical, and biological properties. So we have these properties that we touched on here earlier today. And then we talked a little about the processes, right? The gas exchange, the water movement, cation exchange capacity, things like that. Well, then those kind of relate to the functions, right? So they support plant growth. They purify water. They give us the mechanism, the foundation by which we can grow crops. And then the sort of summative metric or the summative composition of all of these, properties, processes, and functions is therefore soil health. So the history of soil health, or the idea of soil health, is really nothing new. The first reference was actually done by Henry Wallace. This was in 1910. He was a master's student at, I believe it was Iowa State, and he actually later became the USDA Secretary of Ag. But in his master's thesis, he talked about the role that manure plays in soil health. He described the chemical and sort of the physical properties of manure and how valuable that was to the health of the soil. That's that first mention. He was the first one to really kind of coin the term soil health. Then in the 40s, we see kind of the recognition of human health tied to the health of a soil, right? So I'm thinking of the organic movement started by Rodale, Sir Howard, I forget the gentleman's first name, but Howard, right? Those are the kind of the pioneers of the organic food movement. In the 80s, we see the economic value of soil health, right? There are a lot of research and papers that went into the benefits, right? Well, if we have a healthy soil, like, what can we expect from it? Can we get better crop yields? What is the value associated with it? And then the 90s, we saw, well, hold on, let's back up a second. We still don't have a really good definition of soil health. Actually, for about 10 years, until about 2000, there wasn't a good definition of a true encompassing definition of soil health. And in effect, there was great debate over this. Then in about the 2000 to 2010, we really saw a lot of the focus kind of drive to, what are the practices? What can we do to drive soil health, right? Those things that increase organic matter, that generate more activity, soil microbiology in the soil, right? And then now today, the big focus is on the role of microbiology in soils, right? What do they do? Really, we know when I took soil microbiology, the professor, she explained to us that we knew about 2% of all the soil living organisms. We had kind of documented and speciated only about 2% of what we can estimate as all of the soil microorganisms. So we've got a lot of work to do to really fully understand the role of soil microbiology. So again, today we're really kind of seeing the emphasis, right? We're recognizing the role of soil microbes in terms of governing those soil chemical and biological processes, right? There's interesting work on microbial relationships, genetic sequencing, speciation. I touched on that a little bit. And then today we're also seeing a lot of interest in the sort of the soil carbon, right? The carbon markets. How can we kind of mitigate the effects of global climate change through sequestering carbon back into the soil system? It's an interesting thought process, and it's worth exploring for some of the high tooling folks. But for us, I just wanted to give you kind of a background as where we stand on the macro picture of soil health with this. Now let's kind of delve into what we do in terms of our garden. So how do we really measure soil health, and what are the things that we look at with attributing soil health, right? It's really hard. We touched on the soil food web and the chemical and physical biological processes, and that's really just scratching the surface. Soils are what we call heterogeneous, meaning that they vary wildly across spatial and even time. So you come to the soil one day, you take a test, and the next day it'll be entirely different. Same thing, you take a soil test, and maybe 2 inches over, you do another soil test, and it's going to be wildly different. So it's really hard to scientifically assess soil health, and there really isn't one good indicator of soil health. I touched on aggregates, right? The composition, right? All the soil particles binding together, maybe creating porosity, things like that. Aggregate stability is basically the ability of the soil to hold on to those aggregates. And, for as much as that's a good indicator, there's still some things that we haven't worked out. So really, it's hard. It's hard to measure soil health as it relates to what we're doing, right? There's no good thing. And with that, this is kind of what I talk to a lot of my farmers about this. They're very interested in soil health. And one thing that I kind of touch on is, we know the things that we know, and we know the things that we also don't know. And then there's the last little bit where there's we don't know anything that we don't know. So that's kind of how I break it out: tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, right? The indicators of soil health. I'm not going to go into it, but again, just kind of touching on how difficult it is to really ascribe a true value to soil health, or a good indicator, one good indicator of soil health, right? Again, so there are certain things that we look at, again, just available water holding capacity, AWC, right? So that really kind of promotes the sustaining biological diversity, activity, and production, regulates water, and stores and cycles nutrients. Again, this is kind of like that tier 2 indicator, right? So moving on to, well, I'll go ahead and skip this, but really, there's a lot of interest in soil health. There are some folks who are trying to get a reliable assessment tool of soil health, and some of those good examples of that are like the CASH tool, right? The comprehensive assessment of soil health. If you're familiar with Future Harvest and the work that they do, that's one of the tests that they run. One in particular that I think is worth noting is certainly the Maryland Soil Health Card. That's something that we can do in our own backyard. Look that up. We have it here at the Extension office. It's a really simple test that gets you a really good estimation of where do you see your soil health. It looks at the physical, the chemical, and the biological processes as a sort of quantitative evaluation. So we'll touch on briefly kind of generating soil health, what it means for us. Okay. Actually, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, a division of the USDA, came up with 5 principles of soil health. And these are kind of the things that guide management decisions. In Understanding Ag and the Noble Research Institute, some of the other organizations that partnered with NRCS, they said, we'll add one more to it. And I include these to really kind of guide our thought. These are principles. These are principles of soil health, not so much practices, because it's very hard to say, that practice that you're going to do is always going to generate soil health. It's always going to improve soil quality or something like that. There are a lot of factors, as we touched on. Soils can be very heterogeneous. They can be very variable across a field. It's hard to say that one thing is always going to be good. However, the principles, the umbrellas, those are the ones that are going to be fundamentally valuable to your decision-making in terms of what is and what isn't going to improve soil health. So the first one is soil armor, right? Keep the soil covered with living plants, residues, compost, mulch, could even be like plasticulture or plastic over on top. This naturally kind of controls the erosion. I think it's also worth noting that a 5 millimeter raindrop, just a small little dude, impacts the soil surface at 20 miles an hour. I'm no physics guy. I was trying to work out the numbers in terms of what that would look like if that raindrop was a car, like in our terms. And I was getting 6, 7 digits of joules. So this being said, that's a lot of force that raindrop kind of impacts that soil surface. So with that destroys a lot of the soil aggregation. It really affects the soil quality or right there on the surface. It results in crusting, we get erosion, it just moves it away, right? So it's important to kind of keep that from happening, right? We can do that with just increasing the soil armor. Same thing, soil armor improves the temperature variations. That direct sunlight is kind of controlled. We're not really baking our soils. We're not really killing those soil microorganisms just by the amount of temperature or the amount of heat that we have in there. And then also, I think it's great weed control. Some of my farmers really struggle with some of the more challenging weeds that we see in agronomic crops. In a lot of ways, cover crops or soil residues, soil armor is a great way of controlling weeds. And I like saying this expression, the best weed control is dark. Things don't germinate if they don't have the light of day. So the second principle is minimizing soil disturbance, right? We're reducing the incidences of mechanical, chemical, and biological disturbance, right? So, in terms of on the farm side, we kind of practice no-till or conservation till here in Maryland. That's pretty common. In the garden, we can do no dig, right? So we're preserving the fungal networks. We're preserving the amount of biology and the amount of soil organic matter that's there. If we disturb that, if we add too much oxygen, or if we till that, all of that oxygen allows the soil microbes to kind of flush. They get a big burst of energy and they go eat a lot of the soil organic matter. And when that happens, we lose that organic matter over time. So repeated incidences of tillage or disturbance, rather, we get to a point where we're starting to see lower and lower amounts of soil organic matter. So when we mitigate the amount of soil disturbance that we see larger increases in soil organic matter. The third is maximizing plant diversity. And we kind of touched on this in terms of, all the heterogeneity of soils in terms of how complex they are in the food system, in the soil web. Growing different species of cash or cover crops really promotes that cycle. It gives a home for a lot of different soil microorganisms to live. It gives them more things to feed on, and therefore kind of promotes more soil biology, right? This is the easiest way that we can improve the amount of soil biology or the diversity of soil biology that we have. Therefore, we can kind of promote the amount of diverse functions that we have in terms of soil biology. They can do more. There's more of them. There's different types of them. And that results in greater functionality in terms of our ability to grow crops or have a healthy soil. So, extended rotations, I talk a lot about this with my growers. Instead of just doing corn, beans, we say, okay, we'll throw in a small grain, put some wheat in there. Maybe put some hay in, right? Corn, soybeans, wheat, hay, right? Maybe we're kind of extending that rotation, getting a cyclical thing. In the garden, we can do kind of the roots, then transitioning into a potato, go into a legume before we get back into a brassica, right? Those sorts of processes that give us that long rotation, that diversity, okay? And in cover crop systems, I like to see a lot of different species, right? A monoculture is a monoculture, whether that be a cover crop or a cash crop. You can throw a little bit of diversity out in your cover crops. That's always a great start to promoting that soil biology. The fourth is maintaining a living root. And this is really done through cover crops or longer term rotations, even switching to perennial systems. If we can keep a living plant growing throughout the year, we're feeding that soil, right? Those roots have a very, very active role to play in promoting soil microbe activity. They exude certain compounds that soil microbes will latch onto. They'll go munch on that, get some energy, go find some nutrients and actually bring it back to the plant. There's kind of a symbiotic or a mutualistic relationship between soil microbes and plants. So therefore, if we can keep those plant roots in the soil, not only are we holding it there through, kind of mitigating the amount of erosion, but we're also feeding that soil, feeding the microbes. That also improves the biodiversity, right? We're maintaining that which is already there, as well as if we have a diverse cover, if we have a diverse rotation, the more and more that we get to see. So then this one I kind of throw in there. I love putting this out there to my row crop farmers because they look at this and laugh. Integrating livestock, I'm not doing that, right? I don't want to have any cattle. I don't want to have any chickens, what have you. But I will say, this is just about one of the fastest ways that we can see improvements in soil health. The more above ground diversity that we see in terms of livestock as well as cropping systems, the faster that we see improvements in soil health, right? Things like organic matter, nutrient cycling, microbial activity drastically improve when we're integrating livestock into these production systems. So in the garden, this could be something as simple as having a couple hens, having a couple chickens, maybe broilers, fryers, whomever, run around and munch on some cover crops before we go back into, say, tomatoes or something like that. I'm not saying everyone needs to go out and buy chickens or cattle or whatever. I'm just saying that it's a good way of doing that. I also like throwing this out there to some of the folks on the crop side and saying, you can start stacking enterprises. If you're selling anything, maybe you can sell a little bit more per acre. You can sell some beef along with the corn that you've taken off. And then finally, this kind of ties into the naysayers of the last bit, right? So knowing your context. This is that sixth principle that the other two organizations added into the 5 that NRCS came up with. Knowing your context, doing that which is good for your operation or your goals, right? Don't do anything that's not going to lead you to an end goal. You got to know your resources, your skills, any sort of the external influences that guide your decision making. It's very important to know that. Some practices, like we're talking about cover crops, right? That's a practice. That may not work for you in all situations. It's very important to know the context where they will work or where they won't work. And again, it's up to you. You can make that decision where it is. However, again, we touched on those principles, but again, it's just kind of like that it's okay that you don't have to do everything. You don't have to integrate livestock when it doesn't make sense for you to do so. So I always like throwing this in there to some of my crop guys. Why soil health? What does it matter, right? I hear all this stuff and I'm getting tired of hearing about it. And really it boils down to money. And that's how I kind of throw it to my growers is when we improve soil health, we're really kind of seeing the benefits of operational resilience, right? To droughts, floods, rising input costs, things like that. We can kind of mitigate ourselves from that. In the garden, granted, we're not selling anything, however, or we may not be, I'm not sure, we could be. But my point here is saying that, that fly that just, all of the disease pressure that we have, or maybe all of the insect pressure, we can actually start to see decreases in the issues of that just based on improving soil health. I'm not saying it's a guarantee. There are certain things that have to fall in line to make that happen. But it gives us that resilient system where, any external change, weather, pest, what have you, we're well adapted to it because we have healthier soils. We have healthier plants that are therefore able to kind of fend off against those things. That gives us good yields, good quality. And that's really what we're shooting for at the end of the day. We want high quality produce and a healthy garden. So with that, I'll leave you at that and I'll take any questions. This is just my contact information. If you have any sort of other soil health or even agronomic questions about, hey, should I be doing this or that? Feel free to contact me. And if you wouldn't mind, if you do have a second, whip out the phone and scan that QR code. And I'd really appreciate an online teaching evaluation. That kind of helps us know here at Extension. I'm still a new guy, so I need all the help I can get. Let me know what you liked, what you didn't about this presentation. So again, I'm happy to take any questions.
Hey, Mark. Thank you for all of the information there. We do have a couple of questions that we've got down, and Emily, you can feel free to come on too, and we could go every other. But basically, I'll just read the question out and you can answer it for us if that's all right.
That's great.
So we had one in the beginning in reference to the suspension of soil in the jar. So did he say to add dishwasher detergent and how much?
I like a tablespoon and dishwash detergent. That's right. If you have those little pods that have the granular detergent in them, you can maybe bust one of those open and then fill the jar with that. Basically, what you're doing there is, well, I won't go into it chemically, but what you're doing is you're allowing the particles to float a little bit easier so they're not bound up close to each other. So you get a better suspension.
You're separating them, right? Kind of like taking how soap takes, stuff off of our hands, right?
Exactly, right.
Okay. So we've got another question about what kind of soil is best for a garden or a raised bed?
Sure. So I'll say this. I'll first address it on the physical side, right? So we want to see a well-mixed, well-drained soil. So something like a loam, right? Grand scheme of things, we have pretty productive soils here in Maryland. It's hard to beat some of the soils that we have with, intensive management. And if we're adding compost and if we're adding those sorts of organic additions, that really does provide us a good, healthy soil that that we can use to grow some very effective garden crops. So with that, really digging up a little bit of soil, making sure that it's kind of well mixed, and then mixing in some of those organic amendments, compost, leaf grow, maybe in some instances, that gives us those benefits.
Yeah, I put a lot of compost in my garden, in my raised bed soil, and it turns it kind of like a dark black color, because my soil here in Salisbury is really sandy, and it is not that black loamy color. It's sand. So how exactly do cover crops affect your soil, and why are they good? Which cover crops are best to grow in the winter in your garden?
I'm fired up. I love cover crops. I think cover crops are great for a variety of reasons, but I'll touch on kind of the main points as they relate to soil health. So I touched on, in terms of the principles, soil health or soil health principles. So the first one is soil armor, right? So that cover crop, and as it's growing through the winter, right, there's actually the third principle as well, right? You're maintaining a living root. So in essence, what you're doing is you're giving a home for more of those microbes. Cover crops, in essence, are also very carbon rich. They're a plant, right? They're made of carbon. So the more that we can see that add into the soil system, we actually improve organic matter. And we touched on how important organic matter is to those biological and chemical processes that really, help us grow very high quality crops. So that's some of the benefits associated with it. In terms of a cover crop species, I'm going to say it depends. I'm going to be a good extension agent, say it depends. But what I will say is, the kind of the slam dunk ones that I think everyone likes to see is cereal rye. You can even put out wheat or any of those small grains, triticale, things like that. If you're going to, let's say, a nitrogen heavy crop, a crop that really requires a lot of nitrogen, on the agronomic side, for my farmers out there, I like to put out some vetch or some clover or some Austrian winter peas, something like those legumes that we talked about that's going to give us some nitrogen going into the year. Same can be said for the garden. I like vetch before my tomatoes. I think that's a really good and simple idea, because as that cover crop starts to break down, and as those roots start to decompose, that nitrogen is released in the soil, and then that tomato plant can really kind of latch onto that, grab it, and use it for its purposes. To me, I've grown the best tomatoes following a vetch or a Austrian winter pea.
We use cereal rye and clover mix in our raised beds at our community garden here, and it's pretty easy to use.
And to
Don't
that
be
end,
intimidated. You guys can do it in your own backyards. I put it in mine too.
And cereal rye is pretty easy to find.
Mm-hmm.
We have somebody with their hand up. I'm going to ask you to unmute. Perfect. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this presentation. So my question is about cover crops. I'm a small gardener, not a big time farmer. So year before I planted some red clover. I thought I pulled it out during the season, but this season I have a nice carpet on my raised bed. So my struggle now, not a struggle, I'm just glad I stumbled on this. So my question now is, I want to plant in the bed for the season. So I'm thinking of cold hardy crops like onions, maybe cabbage or things like that. For me, I wouldn't want to dig it up, not because I'm just a no dig person, but because I heard it's good, and I am kind of a minimizer of what I need to do in the garden. So my question is, can I just plant in that carpet, just take out a small piece, put my plant in it, and move on for the season?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one thing that we actually struggle with farmers in some ways, is they kill too early, and good for you for leaving it there. Clover does do that. It likes to reseed itself, and if it doesn't reseed itself, a lot of the seeds that you planted earlier don't germinate until the next year, and now you have a carpet of clover. It's terrific. I think that's a great idea. Some ways that you could do it, what I've done in the past is take a little spade, just kind of make either an indentation or maybe even a ring around the area that you want to plant, pull out that clover, maybe kind of break up the soil so that you still have it there in that small hole that you're going to plant into, and then drop a seed or drop a transplant into that. That way you still have the clover that's either living or just about to die right there on the soil surface, but you still have an opportunity for that plant, the crop that you want to grow.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'll take that one step further than Mark said. We mow ours down and then people will plant right into them, and that sort of delays them coming back. But we'll let people leave the clover going all summer. I have raised beds that I let clover go all year in case I don't get planting to them. At least they don't get taken over by weeds. So
We'll keep moving.
Yeah.
How does sheet mulching affect soil health? Because we've talked about sheet mulching to start a garden before. Is this an okay alternative to hardscaping, or is there a better method for removing grass and weeds?
That's a great it depends question. To me, I like sheet mulching. I think it does a good job at weed control and kind of preventing that from happening. I think it's done best in moderation. You know, if you go into a plastic culture situation or something to really just kill the cover crop or suppress weeds right up front, that's great. You know, that really achieves that goal that you're shooting for. Is it done best every year in the same spot over and over again? No, because I think we get in the same problems, same issues as just long-term monoculture, long-term effects of that. So I would say, I think that it's great in moderation, right? Everything in moderation. If it's followed by a cover, terrific. Or if it's followed by a different crop that may not require the sheet mulch, great.
I'm assuming this might be like this question could be about starting a garden in like a new area.
Yeah, I think I agree with that too. I think that's a good way of doing it as well. It can be an alternative. Well, I mean, you two can certainly correct me on this, but I've done it as an alternative to tillage. And I think that's worked out very well in some of my experience.
Yeah. So you've mentioned legumes a few times, and I don't know if we've ever gone over what legumes are in these classes. So do you want to just explain what legumes are and why they're good for soil health?
Yeah, so legumes, I touched on just briefly. So sorry I didn't go into too much detail, but legumes are plants of the legume family, right? So a good example is beans. Beans are legumes, right? Clover is also a legume. Alfalfa, vetch. Interestingly enough, there are some trees that fall within the legume family. Kind of a weird one, but legumes are valuable to soil health in that they do form those microbial symbiotic relationships with certain types of bacteria, meaning those nodules that we saw on one of the slides earlier in the pictures, and I can go back to it here shortly, but that's a function of legumes, right? Legumes and the bacteria there form that relationship. They have those little nodules, and that gives them the ability to produce their own nitrogen, right? One of the main macronutrients that plants need. Typically, we fertilize with nitrogen with other sources. However, legumes don't actually require nitrogen to grow because they create it themselves.
That was a perfect answer. When should you terminate cover crops before transplanting tomatoes? Because I know you'd mentioned planting vetch as a cover crop before tomatoes.
So I kind of go off the vetch. Once it gets kind of stemmy and nasty, that's when I'll do it. And the other thing that I look for is soil temperature. I like planting tomatoes into warmer soils. Some of the folks may disagree with me if you really want, like, especially the market garden folks. I want a tomato by, June 1st. Well, I don't really shoot for that. I like seeing tomatoes, or at least I get my tomatoes come late July, middle of August, somewhere within that range. So I kind of plant when I can, basically. So, but I go off the vetch. Once it gets stemmy, nasty, it starts to flower. That's when I'll try to kill it. I'll actually roll it down. I have a big barrel that I fill with water, and I just basically push it over. And I try to do a kind of a makeshift cover roller crimper, and I welded some small little pieces of steel onto the barrel, and it kind of works. But the vetch will come back a little bit. But all this being said, that is meant to kind of kill that vetch, and then the tomato can come up through that.
So is it too late for vetch or peas in a container garden for tomatoes this season?
I would say maybe. I would say it's maybe a little too late. If I were you, I might look for, instead of vetch or peas, I might go clover. Something like red clover would be pretty quick. I wouldn't even white clover would actually do it, maybe even faster. I might think about seeding some white clover, let it grow as fast as it can, and when you're ready to plant, you're just that much better off. It's not like you're going to have the full benefit of having that cover crop there, because again, we talked about how beneficial it is over the winter and the other soil health things. But I think that's a good start. I think that's a terrific way of doing that.
Yeah.
But I will say with white clover, be careful. It really likes to take over areas, and if it's in a pot, I think that's fine. But mind the white clover; it can be a little fun to deal with sometimes.
Mm-hmm. How can a home gardener plant seeds like beans without tilling after a cover crop?
So to the question on beans, it's very similar to what we talked about a little bit earlier. Just slow the cover crop down as best you can, right? Whether that's mowing, as Emily talked about, or my little redneck barrel, that works just as fine. Well, maybe not as good, but it helps, right? It slows the cover crop down. At which point you can kind of just plant into it as you would normally, right? Move the cover crop a little bit out of the way immediately next to where you're going to plant the seed into the soil, and then go ahead and plant the seed, punch it down. If it's beans, maybe what, half an inch, 3/4 of an inch, put it down in that kind of that moisture zone and let it go. Beans are pretty resilient and they'll come up through that pretty easily.
Yeah, I guess no till and no dig doesn't mean that you're not penetrating the soil at all, right?
Right.
You still have to get seeds in the ground. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of an interesting term, no dig.
Mhm.
Basically, you're not flipping the soil. You're not disturbing it in a very big way, right? You're just kind of moving it around where you can do what you need to do without flipping it.
Yeah, and it's no till for gardening, right?
Yeah.
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 So is there a window or period for having poultry in the garden? Is there a withdrawal period after having poultry in a garden before putting in your vegetables? And then would the manure bacteria be an issue if it isn't really composted yet?
So I will go ahead and say it depends. The first it depends is, are you selling the vegetable? Because if you're selling it, then go by the produce safety rule, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, Haley or Emily, is it 120 days?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head, but I know that you can't actively.
Yeah, but that's if you're selling it, and that's kind of I mean, it's a good rule to have. It's a good rule of thumb. But the maybe the longer or the shorter answer to that question is kind of no. There really isn't a withdrawal period. Would it be an issue? Maybe. It's been my experience that maybe a week or 2 weeks before I'm thinking about planting anything, that's the last time I'm going to add any manure, right? And whether that be natural addition, if there's like, a chicken roaming through the garden, or if I'm actually physically applying any manure. I think that's my estimation. I don't go too much beyond that, or rather shorter than that. I think that 2 week window does well for me.
Yeah, and I think if you are ever going to have manure that hasn't been fully composted in the garden or chickens roaming around at some point, you just have to follow some of these good agricultural practices. So don't eat anything that's fallen on the soil surface. Commercial farmers aren't allowed to harvest things that have fallen on the ground. So you probably shouldn't either, because that's where, if they're really harmful bacteria, they're going to be. And then also, I mean, if you did have chickens running through your vegetable patch, if you were to see any kind of fecal contamination, like that's a piece of produce you shouldn't ingest. Yeah.
So we do have a backyard flock people on the extension, so I put the link in there as well. And I'd actually counter a little what Mark said, and I would do chickens in areas of your garden that you're kind of resting and having cover crops, because chickens are omnivores. So if you let them run through your garden in the middle of the season, there's nothing that's going to stop them from ripping off a tomato or pulling up some of your plants. So if you are going to let them run through to like pick off bugs and stuff, just be out there monitoring them, because chickens will be chickening.
So another question for container soil mixes, I like to add perlite in order to help with drainage. But would the sharp edges of the perlite actually kill earthworms if I mix them in?
First of all, no, it wouldn't be the sharp edges of the perlite. I think it would be if you're shoving a spade in in the earthworm. I think that's what would do it. The physical mixing action, as long as you're not killing earthworms by stabbing them, I think you're good to go. Perlite itself would not be the thing to kill the earthworm.
Okay. And then real quickly, how does somebody amend or change their soil pH if it's really off, if they do a soil test? And
That's a terrific question. I'm sorry I didn't touch on that. So we talked about, and this is why I think it's useful to know that identity, right? The pH plus POH equals 14. You have to know the 14 part, but pH and OH, right? That's kind of the value there. So to raise your soil pH, right, to get it more alkaline, maybe closer to 6 or 7, somewhere in that range. Our soils are a little bit more acidic. We kind of sit in that like 5.5 range. We add calcitic lime. So calcitic lime is calcium carbonate. That CO3, right, is carbonate. It'll split off from the calcium, and that's what's really doing the work. It'll find itself a hydrogen buddy and maybe even 2 to make some water, but it'll also find itself 1 hydrogen buddy and make an OH molecule. And that OH, again, is what is driving that increase in pH or the decrease in the amount of hydrogen that's available in that soil solution. So the answer to your question, barring the chemical thing, is liming materials. So calcium carbonate, calcium magnesium carbonate, that's dolomitic limestone, anything with an OH with it, anything that is labeled as a liming material will help that. And the other thing is organic matter will help in some ways. I'm not saying you need to throw a whole lot of compost out there, but it does buffer changes. It slows the rate at which your soil wants to return back to 5.
And I will say, generally, your soils will tend to acidify over time. So it's good to do soil tests every couple of years. I think our recommendation for home gardeners is like every 3 years. But if your soils were really off, say if they were in the 5s, and you were trying to plant a vegetable garden, you may add lime and then do another soil test to figure out where you're at.
Yep. And in extension, we recommend getting a professional soil test done instead of buying kits from the big box stores. When you buy the big box store kits, you're going to do it and you're going to hold it up. And you're going to say, wow, my soil is a green color, which is pH 6, but that doesn't really tell you a lot about how much of the amendments that Mark talked about that you're actually going to need, versus a professional lab is going to give you much more insight on what that pH actually means and how to actually go about amending it in a healthy way.
Yep. What is the best way to break up hard or compacted soil? I'm in Southern Calvert and my soil looks like modeling clay. We use raised beds, but we're also trying to grow some fruit and it's not going very well.
So I'm a very jaded perspective, and my answer to you is going to be cover crops. There's a gentleman who I work with very closely, and he tells a story. He's a big farmer. Love working with him, but he tells a story of an equipment dealer coming to his farm and saying, I know how I can fix all the compaction issues, and that's with tillage, right? If we till the soil more, we're actually going to reduce compaction. Well, he looked at him and he goes, son, I can do more with this root than you can ever do with that piece of iron. And I really subscribe by that. I think that's a really good thought process. So something like a deep-rooted cover crop growing in the off season will kind of bust through that compaction layer. There's actually a cover crop called a tillage radish, or I'll call it anecdotally known as or colloquially known as a tillage radish. It's a daikon radish. It's a white, kind of large growing radish, and it produces this just super powerful taproot that punches down into the soil and alleviates that compaction. And then up at the surface, obviously it's a radish, so it expands outward and is pushing that soil at the surface outward. With caution, they stink when they start to decompose. So I would say just be prepared for maybe one of the worst aromas you'll ever see, but I can nearly guarantee that you will not have soil compaction year after year, cycle after cycle with implementing radishes and the diverse cover crops. Maybe some cereal rye in mixed with that, maybe a little vetch as well.
Yeah, I will say, depending on where you are in the state of Maryland, sometimes the hard winter like soil freezes will kill off daikon radishes, but where I am on the lower eastern shore, they like winter doesn't always kill them off. So then they keep growing into the spring. But I mean, that's still okay. They're doing their job. You just might have to take them out another way.
And frankly, in a garden, they're delicious.
Okay, I've never actually eaten one.
Oh, that
Did you
make a
taste
little
good?
roast them like potatoes, and they're pretty good.
Okay.
They're a little spicy. I
They're a
pickle
little
them.
spicy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're good pickled.
Just a few more. How do we prepare a garden for cover crops? So is there anything special you would do before planting?
To me, I just scatter seeds. I really don't do anything in terms of preparation. You can if you really wanted to, but that kind of nullifies the whole idea of no-till, and you could run actually, I'll tell you what, in a garden, it might not be a bad idea to broad fork it. If you just run a broad fork over it, it's still considered no dig. The tines of a broad fork just kind of loosen the soil a little bit, scatter the seed over the top, and then be done with it. I think that's a good alternative.
Wait, do you mean a pitchfork?
Broad
I've-
fork.
A broad fork.
It looks like,
I know what a broad.
I'll put a link to it. I remember doing this as a kid, boy.
I was gonna say, if you are gonna scatter your seeds, one issue we see that farmers have if they just broadcast or throw seeds down is you're gonna need it's helpful to do this at times of the year that are cooler, but then that seed, if it's just laying on the soil surface, is going to need irrigation. So if you can water the next few days after you've broadcasted seeds, especially if we're having kind of like a warm October when you're putting it out, that's really important in order to get that cover crop to germinate. Okay, so what is the best product I can add to my garden for soil health? Oh, wow. Yeah. I've
Cover
never-
crops. That's my off top answer. In essence, there really isn't one product, right? There's no one thing that's going to improve soil health. It's a culmination of your ability to manage, right? How well are you, we talked about the principles of soil health. If you're following those principles, if you're guided by those principles through your practices, you're improving soil health, right? Again, I jumped on it. I'm going to say it again. Cover crops are just real easy. That's a really, really good way of hitting some of those soil health principles with one practice, effectively using them either, in off seasons, right? Whether it be in the summer or going through the winter. I think cover crops are a slam dunk.
Yeah, awesome. We have a lot of, I think there's a lot of interest in cover cropping, and I hope to see, people feel free to share photos of any of your cover crops, because some of them I think are really beautiful, like crimson clover, and they can be almost as much fun to grow as like your summer tomatoes, I think. Yeah, well, with that, I think we would just like to thank our speaker, Mark. You gave us like a great soils 101 introduction, and then all of the useful advice about how to apply this when you're actually gardening. So hopefully we can have you back in the future for another talk. And otherwise, we hope to see you guys all in 2 weeks. I think
Michaela's talking about pollinator gardens in 2 weeks.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that
So-
sounds right.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming.
Oh boy, thank you. Thanks for having me.